It is the spring of 1945. The war in Europe is nearly over, and everyone knows it. Allied forces have pushed deep into the heart of Germany, shattering the Wehrmacht division by division, city by city, until the great military machine that had once terrorized an entire continent has been reduced to something desperate and broken. Columns of German prisoners stream westward along dusty roads, hands clasped behind their heads, faces grey with exhaustion and defeat. For most of them, the war is finished. For most of them, the long nightmare has ended in capture rather than death. And in that awful arithmetic, they understand themselves to be the lucky ones. On one particular afternoon, the exact date lost to the fog of administrative records, though the incident itself has been retold with remarkable consistency by multiple witnesses. An American military policeman is processing a group of newly captured German soldiers at a temporary holding facility somewhere in the American zone. The soldier doing the processing is doing his job. He is not rough with the men. He is not cruel. He is simply working through the routine of war, recording names, checking for weapons, directing men to their designated areas. It is unglamorous work, the kind of work that wins no medals and appears in no dispatches. And then one of the German prisoners spits at him. The act is deliberate. It is contemptuous. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary thing to do when you are a defeated man surrounded by armed soldiers of the force that has just dismantled your army. The American soldier, understandably, reports the incident up the chain of command. And that chain of command, by a series of escalations that speak to the gravity with which the matter is treated, eventually reaches the desk of the man commanding the 3rd United States Army, General George Smith Patton, Jr. What happens next is not what anyone expects. It is not a punishment detail. It is not a formal reprimand processed through military bureaucracy. What Patton does instead reveals something about the man that his popular image, all pearl-handled revolvers and theatrical bluster, tends to obscure. It reveals a mind of genuine subtlety, a commander who understood that the war being fought in 1945 was not simply a war of bullets and territory, but a war over what kind of world would be built in the rubble when the shooting stopped. And that understanding, in this one strange and human moment, produces a response that still surprises people more than 80 years later. To understand why Patton's reaction matters, you need to understand the extraordinary pressure bearing down on American military commanders in the final months of the Second World War. The fighting in Europe had been brutal beyond description. Since the Normandy landings of June 1944, the Allied forces had clawed their way across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and into Germany itself, suffering casualties that ran into the hundreds of thousands. The Battle of the Bulge alone, the great German counteroffensive of December 1944, had cost the Americans more than 75,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in 6 weeks of fighting in the frozen Ardennes forest. It had been the bloodiest single engagement in American military history. By the spring of 1945, the mood among American servicemen was a complicated mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something that had not yet found its proper name. A kind of compressed rage that comes from years of watching your friends die, from years of cold and mud and shell fire, from years of being shot at by an enemy who seemed, at certain dark moments, to be possessed of an almost inhuman determination to keep fighting. The German military, even in defeat, even when clearly finished, continued to resist with a tenacity that cost American lives right up until the final days. Men who had survived the Normandy beaches and the Hürtgen forest and the streets of Aachen were still being killed in April 1945, by an enemy that every rational calculation said should have surrendered months ago. Into this atmosphere of compressed feeling, the German prisoner's act of spitting falls like a lit match into dry grass. It is not simply an insult to one soldier. It is to the men who witnessed it and heard about it, an encapsulation of everything infuriating about the enemy: the defiance, the contempt, the refusal to accept the reality of what has happened. The military policeman who is spat upon is a young man. He has, in all probability, been in this theatre of war long enough to have buried friends. The prisoner's gesture is designed to wound him in a way that a rifle cannot. The easy response, the expected response, the response that would satisfy the immediate emotional appetite of everyone who hears about the incident, is punishment, confinement, a reduction in rations, some formal acknowledgement that this behavior will not be tolerated. That is what the chain of command anticipates when the matter reaches Patton. That is what the witnessing soldiers almost certainly expect. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps stories like this one coming. Patton reads the report. He sits with it, and then he calls for the German prisoner to be brought to him. What happens in that meeting is the part of the story that people find so difficult to place within their existing understanding of George Patton. The general who had slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a Sicilian hospital in 1943, an incident that had nearly ended his career and had made him briefly the most controversial military figure in the Western world. That same general now does something that no one in his command structure anticipates. He does not berate the prisoner. He does not threaten him. He does not make any display of the considerable power he holds over this man's immediate future. Instead, according to the accounts that have survived in memoirs and unit histories from the period, Patton speaks to the prisoner with a kind of formal respect. He tells the man, through an interpreter, that he understands why a German soldier might feel contempt for his captors. He does not excuse the act, but he demonstrates a willingness to engage with the psychology behind it that is remarkable from a man whose public persona was almost entirely constructed around dominance and aggression.
Patton tells the prisoner something to the effect that he would have felt similarly in his position, that pride is a soldier's last possession, that he, Patton, respects a man who has fought hard, even an enemy. He then ensures that the prisoner is treated correctly with the full protections of the Geneva Convention, no more and no less, and dismisses the matter. The reaction among his own men is mixed, as you might expect. Some are quietly impressed. Some are baffled. Some are angry, feeling that the insult to a fellow American soldier has been inadequately answered. The story circulates through the Third Army with the speed that military gossip always travels, picked up and passed on and embellished and debated in mess tents and command posts across the American zone. What the story exposes, and what its circulation suggests his men found genuinely surprising, is the gap between Patton's mythology and Patton's reality. The mythology was carefully constructed, in part, by Patton himself. The helmet and the riding crop, and the revolvers and the magnificent profanity, these were tools of leadership, ways of projecting an image of implacable force that served a psychological purpose. An army needed to believe its commander was larger than life. Patton understood this with the instinctive shrewdness of a man who had studied military history since childhood, who had read Caesar and Napoleon and Clausewitz, and who knew that battles are won first in the minds of the men who fight them. But behind the performance was something considerably more complex. Patton was, by the standards of his era and his rank, a student of the enemy. He had made it his business throughout the war to understand how German commanders thought, what they valued, what they feared, how they organized their forces and made their decisions. This was not sentiment. It was operational intelligence of the most practical kind. You cannot outmaneuver an adversary you do not understand. And Patton's record of outmaneuvering German forces, from the breakout at Avranches to the relief of Bastogne, suggests that his understanding was both genuine and effective. The prisoner who spat at the American soldier was, in Patton's reading of the situation, not simply a disciplinary problem. He was a data point. He was evidence that German military pride, even in comprehensive defeat, remained a live and volatile thing that required careful management. The war might be nearly over, but what came after the war, the occupation, the reconstruction, the long work of building something stable out of the wreckage of the Third Reich, would require a different kind of skill than the one that wins battles. It would require the ability to treat a defeated people in a way that did not manufacture a new generation of grievances. The generation that had followed the grievances of 1918 had produced, 20 years later, Adolf Hitler. Patton, whatever his considerable personal failings, appears to have grasped this. His response to the spitting prisoner is, in this light, not softness. It is strategy. The incident did not make the newspapers. It was not the sort of thing that military public relations offices in 1945 considered worth publicizing. A German prisoner spitting at an American soldier was neither heroic nor particularly edifying. And Patton's response, nuanced as it was, did not fit neatly into any available narrative. The war was entering its final weeks. There was enough genuine heroism to report without dwelling on awkward human complications. But the story survived because the men who witnessed it or heard it told found it genuinely remarkable. It survived in letters home and in unit memoirs and in the kind of oral history that veterans carry with them for the rest of their lives and eventually pass on to their children and grandchildren. It survived because it complicated the picture, and human beings are instinctively drawn to complications in stories they thought they understood. George Patton died in December 1945, 6 months after the German surrender, from injuries sustained in a motor vehicle accident near Mannheim. He had survived the entirety of the war, the North African campaign, Sicily, the liberation of France, the drive into Germany, only to be killed by a collision between his staff, car, and a military lorry on a quiet road in the Peace. He was 60 years old. He was buried, at his own request, among the men of the Third Army who had fallen in Luxembourg. The man who spat his name unrecorded. His fate after the prisoner of war camps unknown passes out of history at that point. He is a footnote, or less than a footnote. He is a gesture, preserved in the amber of other men's memories because of what it provoked. What it provoked was a window into a commander's character at a moment when character is hardest to maintain, when victory is close enough to taste, when the temptation to be cruel to the defeated is at its greatest, when the accumulated weight of years of war presses down on every decision. In that moment, Patton chose something that his image would not predict and his reputation would not require. He chose a kind of rough, practical decency. The war in Europe had cost somewhere in the region of 70 to 85 million lives. It had destroyed cities that had stood for centuries. It had produced industrialized murder on a scale that still resists full comprehension. In that context, one German prisoner spitting at one American soldier is an almost vanishingly small thing. Patton's response to it is smaller still. But history is often found in small things. It is found in the moments when a man who has the power to be cruel decides, for whatever mixture of reasons, not to be. It is found in the gap between what is expected and what is chosen. A prisoner spat. A general, the most ferocious combat commander the American army had produced in a generation, looked at the situation and chose understanding over punishment, strategy over vengeance, the long view over the satisfying short one. That, in the end, is what shocked everyone. Not the spitting, the response.